a sealed museum in the shape of human thought, and the forbidden works that reveal the hidden design beneath the edge of consciousness.
You once told me you liked strange stories. Well, this one came to mind. It's something I heard years ago when I was working at a bank in Switzerland. The story came from a Japanese man, a surgeon by trade, practicing somewhere in Europe, a brilliant mind, a meticulous operator. You may even find him online. He's been featured on Japanese television more than once. His name was Masato Taira. Now you know how in English-speaking countries, Tyler is a common first name. Well, that's what people called him Tyler. Not because it was his given name, but because Tyra sounded close enough. It became his nickname, his Western mask. But for this story, let's call him something simpler. Let's call him Mr. T. It feels more fitting, urban legend-like, a little abstract, a little unreal, just as this tale deserves to be. Let me tell you how I came to know Mr. T in the first place. Back then, I was working at a bank in Switzerland, a private institution, one that catered mostly to high-net-worth individuals. You've probably heard the term private bank before. As the name suggests, it's a financial service designed specifically for the wealthy, the kind of people commonly referred to as millionaires. One of my clients had undergone surgery, and it was Mr. T who performed the procedure. The client, noticing that Mr. T and I were both Japanese expatriates, decided to introduce us. We only met 3 times in total, but we got along well. Both of us had left Japan, both pursuing specialized professions abroad. There was an unspoken camaraderie in that shared distance from home. When we finally met for drinks, we ended up swapping stories, the kind you collect when you've lived abroad long enough. Strange encounters, unexplained moments, quiet things most people forget. Both of us understood that our lines of work came with certain boundaries. Confidentiality was second nature, so we avoided anything too close to the job. But even so, Mr. T eventually opened up a little. He told me about one of his patients, an older man, wealthy, influential. Let's call him Mr. K. It had been 5 years since Mr. K had gone completely blind. A combination of age and severe diabetes had taken his sight. But thanks to the technology developed by the medical corporation Mr. T worked for, a breakthrough became possible. The system worked like this. A miniature camera would capture real-time images, and those signals' raw, electrical impulses would be transmitted directly to the optic nerve. The result wasn't perfect. The world appeared as a flickering 128 by 128 grid of light. No shapes, no clarity, just a constellation of shifting points. But it was enough to suggest presence, edges, motion. Mr. T performed the surgery himself, implanted the electrodes, calibrated the system. And because Mr. K was a man of means, the entire operation was carried out at his private residence. The surgery was a success. Mr. K emerged from the void of blindness into a twilight realm of dim, clouded vision. Nothing was crisp, but the blackness had been broken. Mr. T explained that the resolution was just 128 pixels, across which might sound abstract. But for comparison, even old CRT televisions, like those using NTSC or PAL formats, typically displayed around 720 by 480 pixels. These were already considered blurry compared to today's LCDs. So at roughly 1/6 the horizontal resolution, it was more like looking at the world through a smeared lens of light than seeing true shapes or forms. Nothing sharp, nothing distinct, just scattered glimmers of light, like looking at the world through a rain-streaked window half remembered from dreams. And yet, when Mr. K opened his eyes and saw the branches of the horse-chestnut tree in his garden swaying gently in the sunlight, he wept. It was a tree he had grown up with, a fixture in the garden of his estate, its silhouette burned into his memory long before blindness came. To see it again, no matter how hazy, no matter how abstract, was enough to stir something deep. Now, I'll admit this part of the story, the technical details of the surgery, has very little to do with what came later. But the way Mr. T described it, the care he took, it stuck with me too. I'd never heard of anything like it before. Before the surgery, Mr. T had visited Mr. K's estate many times. They had long conversations, not just about the procedure, but about art. Almost immediately, they realized they spoke the same silent language, one made of paintings, sculptures, architecture, music. Not just an appreciation, but a deep familiarity, a shared vocabulary of beauty and form. Each house call turned into a salon. They'd talk about a sculpture Mr. K had once seen in Florence, or a quiet oil painting Mr. T had encountered at a museum in the Netherlands. They spoke of formal lineages, stylistic ruptures, how one school of architecture gave birth to another, how a forgotten painter had influenced a movement centuries later. Mr. T told Mr. K about something called the Vermeer pilgrimage, the act of traveling across Europe to see all 30-something surviving works of Johannes Vermeer. Few had attempted it, even fewer had completed it. But Mr. T had. He had stood before every Vermeer known to exist. He had seen not only Gaudi's cathedrals in Spain, but also the rival designs of Domènech and Montaner, Gaudi's lesser-known contemporary. That impressed Mr. K. Here was a Japanese surgeon who could speak of brushstrokes and buttresses, of chiaroscuro and Catalan modernism. A man who could operate not just on the body, but who clearly saw. So when the surgery was complete, when Mr. K, after years of blindness, could once again perceive light and motion, however dim, he wanted to repay Mr. T. Not with money, not with gifts, but with a glimpse of something he had never shown anyone before. A work of art.
There's something here, something not shown to many. If you love art, as you say, you may be one of the few meant to see it.
With those words, Mr. K handed Mr. T a letter of introduction, something his butler had prepared in advance.
Take this letter to the address written within. If you present it in my name, I believe they'll grant you access without hesitation.
That's how it was, or so it seems. Judging by the way Mr. K spoke, Mr. T had gone to the place written on the letter, believing he was about to witness something truly rare, some hidden piece of art, known only to a select few. It was said to be deep in the mountains. Mr. T managed to reach a small village nearby, guided by the address. From there, he followed the notes Mr. K had given him. Walking along a narrow path, through the hills, no signs, no markers, until he finally came upon it. An old stone structure, surrounded by moss-covered walls and a heavy iron gate mottled with rust. It resembled one of those aristocratic estates, the kind the French call a chateau. Yet at the same time, there was something else in its presence. Something that whispered of a museum, one long sealed away from public knowledge and sight, perhaps not even remembered. The iron gate stood before him tall, meticulously wrought, its black surface polished so deeply it caught the mountain light like water. No crest, no inscription, only a lattice of bewilderingly complex patterns, woven like a language forgotten before language itself. Mr. T searched for a bell, or a knocker. There was none. He stood still, uncertain whether to call out or simply remain until something noticed him. And then quietly, with no sound of approach, a woman appeared on the other side of the gate. At first, he wondered if she might be the mistress of the house. But as she came closer, He sensed she was not the one who owned this place, but someone who had long belonged to it. A guide, perhaps, but not one of this world. She was not old, and yet he could not say if she was a grown woman or a girl. Her presence floated, suspended between ages, between eras. She did not seem to exist entirely within the flow of this century's time, nor within the gravity of this world. She wore a long, dark green dress, the color of forest shadows and forgotten evenings. Its hem was trimmed with delicate white lace, and a black ribbon, shaped like a tilted cross, swayed at her chest. Her skin was pale, almost luminescent, like porcelain kept from sunlight. And her hair was the faintest shade of cream, as if drawn from old parchment. Mr. T reached into his coat and gently produced the letter, the one entrusted to him by the old man, Mr. K. He extended it with both hands, and the woman received it without a word. She opened the envelope and unfolded its contents, her eyes scanning the page with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. For a moment, nothing moved. Then she lifted her gaze and met his eyes. One silent nod. No smile, and then without uttering a single word, she turned and opened the gate. It was mechanical, though aged, with a deep grinding sound of chain and gear. The heavy iron doors began to part, as if awakening from a long dormancy. The woman stepped aside, beckoning him forward with the slightest tilt of her head. Mr. T followed. Beneath his feet, the path was paved with wide slabs of blue calcite, its polished surface catching the light and scattering it in hues that shimmered like frozen sky. He crossed that gleaming threshold, guided in silence, and passed into the waiting hush of the building. Apparently, the halls were filled with works of art that no one in the world had ever heard of. Paintings, sculptures, ceiling frescoes, and yet none bore even a whisper of familiarity. Every wall, every alcove, every vaulted stretch of ceiling was adorned with pieces more beautiful than anything Mr. T had ever seen. Beauty so concentrated, so unapologetically present, that it pressed inward on the senses like the hush of a cathedral. At first, he assumed these were the works of unknown masters' talents lost to time, gathered here by some unseen hand. But then he glanced at a nameplate: Michelangelo, then Botticelli, Da Vinci, Rodin. The names were there one after another, the very names that would crown any museum wall, names whose mere mention evokes centuries of reverence. And yet the works beneath them, the paintings, the sculptures, the etched marble and gilded wood, were not familiar renditions. They were more. They carried a weight of perfection so profound, so unearthly in their composition and execution, that the masterpieces Mr. T had studied all his life now seemed like sketches, like studies made in preparation for these, the true forms. He told me this again and again, that he was not mistaken. These were not just better works by known artists, there were other pieces too, many of them, paintings and sculptures that radiated an even more terrifying excellence, a refinement so complete that it seemed to defy humanity itself. And the nameplates beneath these names he had never seen before, not once. And this from Mr. T, a man who could recite, from memory, the full canon of Western art history. The female guide said her name was Laura. Yes, her name was Laura September. The fact that her family name used the word for the moon's cycle, September, struck Mr. T as unusual, and it remained in his memory. Now that he thought about it, he remembered something else. Her long, pale, cream-colored hair. It swayed ever so gently. Even though they were inside the mansion and there was no breeze, it moved, as if stirred by a wind that only she could feel. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But he noticed it as Mr. T stood, overwhelmed by the breathtaking artworks displayed in every direction. Laura, the guide, quietly began to explain some of them. For example, there was a painting of a nearly nude goddess, evocative of Bronzino's allegory of the triumph of Venus. The figure's skin shimmered with such vitality that Mr. T could hardly believe it was a painting. It looked alive. Laura explained, the artist developed a unique technique of layering hundreds of ultra-thin glazes of oil paint. You see, when light hits human skin, it doesn't just bounce off. It penetrates slightly, scatters within, and then re-emerges. That diffusion, that soft depth, it's what gives real skin its glow. This artist reconstructed that effect, embedding the behavior of light itself into the paint. It's akin to the way wax figures appear lifelike under lighting, except here, it's compressed into paint, only 1/10 of a millimeter thick. Mr. T said that as he shifted his position in front of the painting, the skin of the figure appeared to subtly change. Though it was undeniably a flat canvas, it reacted to light as if it were three-dimensional flesh. It was unnerving. It felt, he said, like looking at his own skin, mirrored back at him. Not only did the workmanship resemble nothing Mr. T had ever seen before, but even when he was given an explanation of the technique, it didn't resemble any existing method or process that he knew of. It seemed as though the techniques used belonged to a logic beyond human craftsmanship. The museum, or whatever that place was filled with countless such works. Not just one or two, it was packed, each piece more exquisite, more impossible than the last. At first, Mr. T said he was overwhelmed, even thrilled. He thought to himself, why hasn't something this amazing ever been made public? But then, he felt something deeper than awe. He said it wasn't just beautiful, there was fear embedded within that beauty, a fear that came from not being able to understand, from standing before something that should not exist. And he put it like this.
The inside of the mansion was, to put it in words, it was horrifying and beautiful.
On the ceiling, geometrically and even logically impossible curves twisted and tangled into one another. Though he was seeing them with his own eyes, his brain could not process them as coherent, three-dimensional forms. Mr. T felt as if the very resolution of space itself was being undone. At first glance, he reflexively thought of the repetitive plant shapes seen in the close-up photographs of Karl Blossfeldt, the German botanist and photographer. He wondered if what he saw was a development of those motifs, fused further with the so-called ultra-Baroque style. That Baroque, born of the violent mixture of Christianity and indigenous Mexican culture. But the longer he looked, the less that interpretation made any sense at all. On the surrounding walls, some paintings shone in vivid colors, but none of them belonged to any recognizable cultural tradition. What was depicted was clearly symbolic, and yet what it symbolized was utterly unknowable. It looked like a myth, but was no myth. It resembled religion, yet lacked any object of faith. The sublime and the chaotic, silence and screams, cold calculation and frantic madness, all coexisted with the exact same weight and presence. And yet, there was nothing discordant about them. It was a harmony that should not be possible within the architecture of the human mind. If anything, it was the absence of failure that made it feel so deeply wrong. These works were beautiful, but they had been created according to the logic of a wholly different intelligence.
Even if I try to explain it here, Without the actual thing in front of you, I can only give you a string of hollow adjectives.
After saying this, he went quiet for a time. But he told me that something began to shift within him. He was, at that moment, standing before something beautiful. Something indescribably beautiful. He should have felt elation, the thrill of witnessing a beauty unknown to the world. And yet, a heaviness grew in his chest, a quiet sadness. Then he heard it, music drifting through the vast hallways of the building. From that moment on, Mr. T began to understand. What he had encountered inside the mansion wasn't merely rare or beautiful. It was something deeper, something far more unsettling. He stood still, listening. It sounded like a symphony performed by familiar orchestral instruments. And yet, the sound did not strike the eardrums as it should have. Instead, it bypassed hearing entirely. It touched a nerve, a region buried deep inside the skull that had no name. It wasn't sound, it was resonance. Mr. T found himself thinking of the pineal gland. He knew, of course, that in the human body, the pineal gland was an endocrine organ deep in the center of the brain. It secreted melatonin, the hormone that regulates the circadian rhythm and promotes sleep. In some animals, it functioned as a light receptor, but never as a receptor of sound. And yet, despite that knowledge, Mr. T could not shake the feeling. The music was reaching something in that area. It was as if the sound, or whatever it was, had bypassed the usual senses entirely and was pressing gently but unmistakably against the space where the pineal gland lay hidden. And that realization unsettled him more deeply than he could explain. If Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach were geniuses of the human kind, then this music felt like a score reconstructed from the dreams that echo through a genius's mind after death, when memory fades and only truth remains. When the music stopped, silence returned. And then, the woman who had guided him, Laura, returned and began to speak.
Orion. That is the name of a composer who stands as a first-class star among humanity, a brilliance we place far above Beethoven, Mozart, or Bach.
Mr. T quickly realized that the name of such a composer had never appeared in the history of Western music. It wasn't just that the name was unfamiliar, he had never encountered even a rumor or footnote that hinted at such a figure.
Orion. That's not the real name. It's the name we use a veil, if you will. There is a true name that belongs to the composer, but I won't speak it here. If you were to carry that name out of this place, it wouldn't be safe. Not for you, and certainly not for the world that holds its breath in balance.
Her words, cryptic and serene, unsettled Mr. T. He felt a chill, not from the air, but from the weight of what she withheld.
Orion's body was exceptional. They were born with 7 fingers on each hand. The music, what you just heard, was composed for a body unlike yours or mine. No one else could have written it, and certainly no one could have performed it. What you heard wasn't played live. The keyboard part was recorded directly by Orion using a 19th century self-playing mechanism, an antique device called the ver1.0.2.
Mr. T described it in his own words like this.
I take pride in having listened to a comprehensive range of what the world considers classical music. Yet despite all that experience, I found myself utterly speechless. I didn't have the words to describe even the contours of the melody I was hearing. There was indeed a melody, but it belonged to no order our musical theory would recognize. It was something prior to order, a sound like the stirring of a fetus in the womb, before music is even born. And the moment I heard it, I understood something terribly. I cried, not because the music was beautiful. I cried out of pain. It wasn't sadness. It was the pain of realizing that I had been deceived all along, that we all had. Everything I believed I knew about beauty, every framework, every rule, every notion was not mine. It had been planted, shaped, and quietly enforced. What I thought was understanding was simply confinement. It's like a child who has only ever been given picture books and heard nothing more musical than the soft humming of a caregiver. Not songs, not instruments, just unformed sounds carrying no structure or scale. Never taken to a museum, never heard a real orchestra. Such a child would grow up believing they knew what art was, what music was, but their eyes, ears, and mind would be shaped entirely by what was offered, never knowing what had been withheld.
Mr. T suddenly realized something with terrifying clarity. In that mansion, surrounded by those impossible works of beauty, he was no more than a helpless infant, or perhaps not even that. He was a fetus, fed only picture books and fragments of humming, and shaped gently, precisely, to remain in that state, shaped and kept there. He hadn't merely been a fetus, he had been made into one.
If there exists a mind that perceives form and space only to the extent of the illustrations in children's picture books, and another that navigates form and space with the iconographic awareness of Michelangelo and Raphael, then it is painfully clear which mind will end up controlling the other. There are those who know this, who understand how such asymmetry is engineered, and who apply it deliberately and without mercy.
He began to notice something, that our consciousness, everything we imagine, admire, or feel, is built solely upon what we have been allowed to see, what we've seen before, what beauty we've been shown, what forms and orders have been presented to us. It is only through those inputs that our minds are shaped, and it is only from those extensions that we can think, dream, or feel moved. Without that scaffolding, neither mind nor consciousness can be constructed. But the beauty and the art that existed inside that mansion, they came from outside that scaffolding, from beyond the frame, a beauty that reached directly into the core of his awareness and shook it from the foundation. And with that, Mr. T understood. All the works displayed in that sealed museum and the impossible music he had heard, they were not just wonders. They were evidence. Evidence that our minds have been thinking all along within a frame quietly, maliciously designed by those who benefit from its shape.
Or perhaps it's better to say it this way. It was proof that we've been forced to think within a frame deliberately and quietly imposed by a hidden class of privilege. What frightened me the most was knowing that there are people in this world who are allowed to see it, people who have always been allowed to see it. If that beauty, the kind sealed within that mansion, had been made public from the beginning, then maybe the consciousness of humankind could have evolved, expanded, awakened. But no, that beauty is gripped tightly by a hunger for control, and so it is sealed here, in this place. Why? So that someone, a very, very small number of people, can remain upstream of consciousness. The people who reside at the highest peaks of aesthetic experience, they are not merely part of our culture, they stand behind it. And they hide the real thing within a system so complete, so perfectly constructed, that most will never even know it exists.
Shortly after his visit to the mansion, strange things began happening around Mr. T. According to Mr. T,
Figures. Figures reminiscent of the men in black that appear in paintings by René Magritte or Paul Delvaux, they've begun to appear, roaming around me, watching, never speaking.
he began receiving phone calls where the only thing on the other end was the sound of silent breathing. No caller ID, no record, just the sound. Then the line would go dead. At the hotel where Mr. T was staying for work, the front desk told him that several men had come by asking for him. Men in black suits, each of them wearing round black bowler hats. They left a message. They wanted to ask Mr. T about a certain artwork he had recently seen. That night, it felt as if someone was standing just outside his room. But the next morning, his memory was hazy, as if something had quietly been erased. He tried to pull up Mr. K's surgical record through the internal database of the medical corporation he worked for. But Mr. K was gone. No name, no file, not even a blank entry, as if the old man had never existed. Even the mansion, that vast estate Mr. T had visited, was now a bare stretch of lawn. No gates, no stone walls, just an empty field. And the strangest part is Mr. T didn't notice any of this until nearly a month had passed. It wasn't just data that had been altered. Something deeper had been adjusted. He told me he had never spoken about any of this before, but he wanted someone, just one person, to hear it.
It's not a story about art. It's about who holds the unreasonable authority to shape the boundaries of human consciousness. That mansion and the countless works of art hidden within it, they were not just showing beauty. They were observing us. They were watching the limits of our thinking from somewhere far outside the frame. And for those who try to see more, those who dare to trace the outline, to find the edge of what we've been allowed to know, there is only one gift waiting for them: silence. Somewhere in this world, there is knowledge and information that we were never meant to touch.
That's how Mr. T ended his story, or at least how I remember him finishing it. He never contacted me again. No follow-up, no farewell. And now, retelling it all like this, something about the silence that followed feels heavier than I first let myself realize. I don't think the danger came from him telling me. It was something else. He peered into the rupture yawning at the threshold of human consciousness. And worse, he understood. He glimpsed the scaffolding behind our reality, the hands that built the frame around our thoughts, and recognized them for what they were. Perhaps that alone was enough. And now, telling the story again like this, I suddenly find myself worried. Worried that something might have happened to him either since the last time we met, or by now,